Welcome back to the Go to the Field podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Wormer.
I'm Eric Osland.
So we're going to kick off season 2. So Eric and I decided it was time to get back in the studio a little bit and do some recording. So what we want to talk about today is the 4th most needed nutrient for corn, soybeans, and wheat. Talking about that 4th most needed nutrient past nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is sulfur. One of the things, why are we talking about sulfur? Well, one, and you've heard a lot about it, is the Clean Air Act. Taking a lot of that sulfur from the power plants. And then, we're not getting as much free sulfur as what we've had in the past. Those coal burning power plants are cleaned up. We're not getting that through the acid rain, the free sulfur. And then also another part of it is more bushels. Yields have increased through the years, so we are removing more sulfur from the soil.
Yeah, I feel like we talk about this a lot with the Clean Air Act, but then, I don't know if you see a lot of data that supports that at times. One of the things that I found, just talk about real quick, and I think this came from Purdue and Michigan, but back in 2004, this is when they started testing these fields. There was probably, it looks like 2 to 3% of agriculture of crop fields that had sulfur levels that were below 8 parts per million or 16 pounds of sulfur. And then as time went on, when we got to 2014, that number jumps up to about 60%. So it kind of shows over time how much more sulfur deficiencies we have today than we did back in maybe the early 2000s.
Locally, we've seen positive yield increases from the addition of sulfur to that nutrient management plan. And then with that, there's also been a lot of work done from some of the universities with the addition of sulfur to that management plan that support a lot of it. There's been a fair amount of work done, whether it's Purdue and also the University of Illinois.
Yeah, one of the Purdue studies, I guess I printed off and have in front of me right now. So when they applied 200 pounds of nitrogen and they did not couple that with any sulfur, those particular plots averaged yield of 263 bushels. So still really good yields. But the interesting thing was when they paired that with 36 pounds of sulfur, that yield went from 263 to 289. So, you can see some pretty substantial yield bumps from that addition of sulfur, and that was on corn.
Which soybeans are big too, and not to mention wheat. All 3 crops,
yes.
Corn, soybean, and wheat, all need sulfur.
Absolutely. And, similarly have some data here from Purdue as well on soybean yields. Untreated soybeans, so no addition of sulfur to these beans, yielded 75 bushels. And then when we added 100 pounds of AMS, so we're getting 24 pounds of sulfur from that application. And that yield bumps up from 75 to 90. Kind of interesting because, there's been a lot of talk and research done over the years on the addition of supplemental nitrogen to soybeans. And this same research where they simply added urea, they saw a 2 bushel increase, but when they coupled that nitrogen with additional sulfur, like in an application of ammonia sulfate, that yield bump went from 2 bushels to 15. So pretty interesting. And I think, in my opinion, there's some opportunity there on the soybean side as well. And the addition of sulfur to try to get over some of these yield plateaus that we've seen over the last few years.
Starting out, one thing to note, there's potential. We'll talk about the deficiency symptoms. There can be a hidden hunger. Once we see some of those deficiency symptoms show up in the plants, we've probably lost some yield already. One thing to understand about sulfur is it's immobile in the plant and it's mobile in the soil. So really, what does that mean? Immobile in the plant, it cannot transport from some of the older tissue into the newer tissue. So basically where you're going to see those deficiency symptoms is in the newer growth of that plant. So some of the things that you could see in corn specifically, you could see some yellowing between the veins. It's going to give like a striped look and it's going to be up towards the whorl. When I've seen some of this in the field, it's more in that, I would say in between the V6 to V8 growth stage when it's growing right in there. You can see maybe just a yellow cast across the field, and it can show up in spots. It could be circles within the field or just uneven striping throughout that field. And some of the times, years ago, I think we're getting a little more diligent with some of the sulfur applications in corn. but you start to see some of that yellowing in that field. Soybeans, you're going to see more of a pale green to yellowing in the upper leaves is what you're going to see. So, like I said, it may not be uniform in that field across the whole thing because there's going to be different sulfur availability. Some of that's going to come from the organic matter, mineralization through there. So you may see it show up a little worse in spots than others.
And I think you mentioned this, Ryan. Sulfur, it's going to be immobile in the plant, right? So you're going to see it on the new growth, but then it also is mobile in the soil, specifically sulfate. The sulfate form of sulfur is going to, it has a negative charge, so there's nothing that's going to keep that sulfur from leaching out through the soil profile. So think of it kind of like nitrogen. And, also similar to nitrogen, you have to figure out, how are we going to implement sulfur into our fertility program every year? Because we can't really depend on that sulfur being there, on that sulfate being there from the year before.
So since we do need sulfur each year for these three crops, let's talk about the specific needs for each crop. So everybody's after the elusive 300 bushel corn. So if we look at 300 bushel corn specifically, the way we like to look at it is you need about 0.1 pounds per bushel for sulfur uptake in corn. So if you think about that, 300 bushel corn, you're going to need about 30 pounds of sulfur for uptake. 50% of the sulfur is taken up during the vegetative stage, with a balance of it taken up during reproduction. So we need to make sure that we have sulfur available for grain fill in corn.
Yeah, so then soybeans, they are going to take up about 0.28 pounds of sulfur per bushel. So again, talking about yield goals and the elusive 100 bushel soybeans, that's going to require, approximately 28 pounds of sulfur per acre. Soybeans, maybe similarly to corn, they need sulfur through that whole growing season, but a lot of the uptake of the sulfur in soybeans is going to be kind of post-reproductive. And, soybeans are producing a lot of protein, and that's one of the things that sulfur is doing in the plant is helping to develop that protein. So getting that sulfur on the back end of soybean when we're developing those pods and developing those beans is really important. So when we're thinking about, again, 120 bushel wheat, we need about 30 pounds of sulfur. So regardless if we're talking about high yielding corn, soybeans, or wheat, we generally are going to try to incorporate about 30 pounds of sulfur per acre.
So I guess the rule of thumb of what that crop needs that we need to look at is everybody's going to have a different yield goal. Not everybody is going to be shooting for 300 bushel corn. There's a lot of different soil types, especially on soybeans as well. You're not going to get the 100 bushel everywhere. You're not going to get the 300 bushel everywhere on corn. But the biggest thing to remember is, what your yield goal is. You need 0.1 pounds of sulfur per bushel on corn, 0.28 on soybeans, and then 0.25 on wheat. So if you take your yield goal and multiply it by those factors, then you can get the amount of sulfur needed for your crop for uptake.
So one of the things to consider when we're thinking about how are we going to incorporate this sulfur is the form of sulfur that we're applying to that acre, right? So there's kind of three, but ultimately two different options, I guess, that you can consider here, and that is elemental sulfur. So elemental sulfur is going to require an oxidation phase to actually break down to a form that either a corn plant, a soybean plant, or a wheat plant can actually use. And it's going to be oxidized by bacteria. It's going to convert into sulfuric acid, which is partly where some of that acidification properties comes from elemental sulfur. And then ultimately, that sulfuric acid is going to break down into a sulfate form of sulfur that plant can utilize. One of the things to consider and to keep in mind when dealing with elemental sulfur is that breakdown process can be relatively long. Sometimes the total oxidation of elemental sulfur can take up to 400 days.
So when I'm thinking about elemental sulfur, if I'm going to make that part of my management plan, I'm going to want that on well ahead of the crop going into the ground. I'm going to want that on in the fall. That's when I'm thinking is fall applications. And I want that on early so I can start that oxidation process. So if you think about it, even through the fall, you're not going to have much of an oxidation process throughout the winter. just due to the fact because it's for that to break down and go through the process, soil temperatures need to be up. You need to have plenty of moisture, and your pH needs to be correct as well. So there's a lot of factors that go into breaking down elemental sulfur into sulfate, which is the usable form for the plant.
Yeah, and then the other form we've mentioned a couple times here is we can just apply sulfate. There are forms of sulfur or products that have just a sulfate form of sulfur. So that requires no conversion. It's readily available pretty much immediately. As soon as the roots uptake that sulfate, it's able to be taken up by the plant. So sulfate also, it doesn't have any impact on your soil pH like what elemental sulfur does. So you won't have that acidification of the soil with the sulfate.
Eric, I know you mentioned the two forms. Let's talk about the third. So I think this is the appropriate time to bring it up. And then it's such a big product for us at the Equity. And then that's the thiosulfate form. So we've got that available in ammonium thiosulfate and potassium thiosulfate. So it says sulfate at the end. So automatically you're thinking it's readily available to the plant. But when you use some of the thiosulfate, it has a breakdown process as well. So what it does, the thiosulfate breaks down into tetrathionate. So I know that's a little complicated, but the breakdown process is not as long as what elemental is. But from that tetrathionate, it usually breaks down and is available in the sulfate form for that plant in about 1 to 4 weeks. And temperature, if it's up, soil temperature's up, it's going to drive that a little bit quicker. If you use it for a pre-emergent application or if you use it in a side dress application, it is going to be readily available for that plant. So as we think about our sulfur management plan into the next year, there's plenty of opportunities and products out there to make a good plan ahead of the crop. So, I mean, when you're spreading your drive, obviously there's elemental, which needs to be applied in the fall. Then we've also got different products that can blend easily with your dry fertilizer applications. So there's MES10, there's ammonium sulfate, and then also we've got K-Mag, which is potassium, magnesium, and sulfur. So there's plenty of opportunity to get it in with the dry fertilizer, and then there's also some liquids that we can use as well, whether that would be a pre-emerge application or a side dress application. During that pre-emerge and that side dress application, there's ATS, ammonium thiosulfate, and then there's also KTS. ATS mixes very well with UAN, 32%, 28%. KTS, on the other hand, KTS is potassium thiosulfate, which we've not talked about it a lot, but it is a mix of potassium and sulfur. So ATS, like I said, mixes really well with UAN, but KTS can be a little fickle. If you get it too heavy, if the ratio's not right, it'll salt out and create you a lot of problems and incompatibility. So we just need to be really cognizant of that. Rule of thumb with KTS is probably a 9-to-1 ratio. 9 gallons of UAN to every 1 gallon of KTS to make sure that application's correct. There's a lot of sources out there to start building a sulfur management plan. I'd suggest talking to your equity salesperson and then getting a good plan together of what fits your management style. What you need, your timing of your applications, and making sure that we get the sulfur available and then some sulfur available throughout the season for your crops, whether it's wheat, corn, or soybeans.
But something just to consider, when you're looking at a product, and even though sulfur is maybe on the label, definitely want to pay attention to how much sulfur is in that product, because even though we're getting a little bit of sulfur out there, we've kind of gone through how much sulfur it really takes to move the needle on some of these crops. So if we're only getting a couple pounds, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference.
And some of the foliar products and things out on the market that have sulfur on it are probably not going to fulfill your whole needs for. Is it potentially a good supplemental to your sulfur management plan? Absolutely. I'm not saying don't use it, but definitely pay attention to the amount of sulfur in each product that you use. So with that, Eric, I think we can conclude this episode on sulfur, and If you have any questions about a sulfur management plan, definitely talk to your equity salesperson. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Thank you.